Jacob, let's start with what motivated your essay. You also start your essay with a disclaimer of sorts, right? You ask, well, is this the time to be talking about political violence on the left, given how much of politics is moving in the world? But you do think that political violence and the role it plays in the imagination is important in the political thought process of the left, and something that we do need to talk about now. So can you tell us why you thought that, and what is it that motivated you to write the essay in the first place?
Yeah, I went back and forth about writing this sort of thing. I've been thinking about writing it for something like 2 years. And I didn't write it because it seemed so obvious that the real problem was coming from the right. You know, it's not the left that's perpetrating the crimes that are being perpetrated in Gaza. It's not the left that is rounding up people in LA or Washington, D.C., in the United States. It's not the left that's in danger of undermining democracy in Europe and in other places. So, you know, against that background, why should I write a piece like this? And then what really sort of turned the changed my mind was reading piece after piece in left-wing magazines of ideas that I found to be so deeply vapid and vacuous about the question of violence. So that, as you said, in a sense, we're having this conversation at one level removed. Because if this were just a question of who's using violence in a day-to-day manner to overwhelm the discursive politics of democracy, the answer would be the right, you know, every day. But if we're asking, how does the left think about violence? And is the left's thinking about violence conducive to its own democratic politics? Well, then the question begins to get more interesting. And the more I read, and the more I listened to, I mean, even listening to the left versus the center left in response to Charlie Kirk's murder, the more I had questions about the left's own understanding of violence, what the sources of that understanding were, and the left's ability to be self-critical. So, you know, the piece is the form of a review of a book that I don't necessarily agree with entirely, but I was troubled by the left's inability to engage with the possibility that it didn't have things right around violence.
Yes, and just to add to that list of recent kind of areas in which political violence has been coming from the right, because someone's asked for us to give some examples. I had some examples in the introduction. I thought I'd just cut them short. But obviously, the right often shrugs its shoulders in the face of political violence directed at its enemies. There was the case of Nancy Pelosi and her husband. Nancy Pelosi wasn't there when intruder entered into their house with the aim to abduct, I believe, Nancy Pelosi, but he ended up attacking her husband, who ended up in the hospital. Then we have two former speakers of the Minnesota House, the former speaker of the Minnesota House and her husband, who were both assassinated. So these are just a couple of recent examples of actual political violence on the right. But you're correct to say that the left feels squeamish about critiquing violence, especially when directed again towards causes or people that it feels like it should be sympathetic towards or is sympathetic towards. But at the same time, you argue that violence is quintessentially, a critique of violence is quintessentially something that the left should be doing and is part, as it were, of its legacy. So tell us why that is. Why is a critique of violence a sort of important left-wing topic?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I take the left to be fundamentally committed to an emancipatory politics, which I read as a democratic politics, where things are decided by a set of procedures dedicated to equal liberty, equal equality, equal voice. You can't have that with violence. Violence is fundamentally the right of the stronger. This goes back to the oldest sort of parts of our philosophical tradition. If Plato is no friend of democracy, but one of Plato's favorite themes to return to again and again is that discourse and pure power, pure force, are at odds. And that phrase that Habermas loves so much, the unforced force of the better argument, well, that reads right back to Plato. I mean, this idea that convincing your opponent, which is the basis of the freedom that democracy both promises and is based on, is at odds with violence. That's what I take to be a fundamental commitment of the left. Now, since the 19th century and Marxism and the rise of emancipatory and revolutionary movements, we've had a tension between radical democracy, which Marx was committed to in his youth. He was a Republican, as sort of a lot of good work in political theory is showing now. On the one hand, on the other hand, the idea that we could actually bring about emancipation through violence. And so when I was sort of referencing the critique of violence, I'm referencing a piece by Walter Benjamin, which he's writing, and this is very important for me. In 1921, the gunshots have just really stopped ringing out in the streets of Berlin. He was, as all of his generation, deeply familiar with political violence, the right-wing Freikorps versus the Spartacists and the radical left, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were, of course, murdered. And Benjamin's asking this question for himself. What would it mean for violence to really be emancipatory? And it's a very complicated argument. He runs through a lot of cycles, but he recognized the problem. He recognized that there was a deep tension that couldn't simply be distilled down to means and ends in this sort of Leninist way. And so that's the tradition of the left thinking that I sort of wanted to bring back up. One that is grounded in discursive democracy, recognizes the challenge of revolutionary politics, but says, well, no, we have to do some thinking about what violence would really mean for our emancipatory commitments.
So, I do want to talk about the sort of intellectual foundations, as it were, of how the left thinks about violence. And there's another philosopher that lurks in the background of all this discussion, Frantz Fanon, and maybe talk about him in a little bit. But I think first I want to talk about this sort of a little bit more of a casual attitude that, again, is maybe shared in this ideological space, that, sometimes political violence is sort of, it might not be ideal, might not be something that we like, but it's just the inevitable result of a set of circumstances, almost like a natural law or a reaction to a set of circumstances or a situation. So I believe there were a few that had a reaction like that to the Hamas attack in October 7. I think you point out in your interview with Anastasia Berg, based on your piece in The Point, that Mahmoud Kali, who I believe is Edward Said's successor.
No. He's a graduate student at Columbia.
My mistake. Yes, the graduate student in Columbia who then got targeted in various ways by the administration. That this was just, you have to see it as a sort of natural reaction to a sort of colonial oppressor, that this is not something that, as it were, enters into the moral domain or maybe even the political domain. How do we think of that kind of reaction? How should we think of that reaction?
That, I think, gets at the fundamental problem here. And that language of necessity that Mahmoud Khalil used in an interview with Ezra Klein, and I picked up on, really puts me in mind of a line from Auden, the poet W.H. Auden. He wrote a poem about Spain. He went to Spain for a month during the Revolution, 1937, and he wrote a poem where he talked about, the necessary murder. And it's a revolution. It's the fascist versus the communist. There are going to be deaths that are necessary. And George Orwell, who had fought in the Revolution, picked up on that line and said, "Wait a minute, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? That's not emancipatory politics." And so it's interesting because, in a sense, I feel that I'm having the same debate that Orwell and Auden had 90 years later. And the background there, of course, is a sort of communist politics, a dialectical politics, that there's going to be a dialectical necessity, that we're just bringing about the sort of inevitable end of politics, which is the proletarian revolution. And Orwell, who had lived within these different left factions, said there is no inevitability. You know, if we read Homage to Catalonia, which I think every leftist needs to read, I mean, if there's one book that every leftist needs to read, it's Homage to Catalonia. The book is really a study of the different forms of left politics, and nothing is inevitable about the Stalinists winning out over the anarchists. And the difference between the Stalinists and the anarchists in that book is infinite. It's the difference between oppression and freedom. And so it's interesting to hear that language of necessity in a completely post-communist environment. And that brings us to, you know, the book that I was reviewing, and which is a book by Adam Kirsch. And Kirsch makes this observation. He says the left is prone to a sort of means ends thinking, where because the end is necessary, the means are justified. And that explains the left commitments to communist totalitarianism in the 20th century. And Kirsch says, I'm going to argue that it explains left commitments to, say, Hamas, post-colonial violence. And I think he has a point. You know, I think there is, like, you can't say that this same sort of necessitarian thinking doesn't exist, because it clearly does. And so we have to deal with that. We have to do the work that Orwell did and say, wait a minute, there is no such thing as a necessary murder. What sort of politics would minimize, would get us away from excusing murder, would get us away from excusing violence and return violence to the sort of real politics that, say, Orwell was interested in, and that I'm interested in as a political philosopher, but also as a participant in politics.
Yeah, this is an interesting theme that comes up a few times in your essay, and I think in the interview that you did with Anastasia later, which is that we often, speaking as well as someone who maybe falls in that sin as well, we sort of take ideals in political philosophy, sometimes ideal examples from history, and then try and kind of read them into contemporary context and contemporary events and think, well, if that was necessary then, or this is how things happened then, maybe this is how things should happen now. The example that you bring in your essay is the War of Emancipation of Algeria and the role that Frantz Fanon had in that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But I guess you're contrasting that with real politics, or political philosophy that is based on real politics, that looks at the specifics of each new situation and the situation on the ground, the kind of details about what's going on, rather than applying a kind of universal map of thinking about these conflicts. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Algeria, I think, is key, and I do hope we get to talk about Fanon. But before you even talk about Fanon, just Algeria as a myth. And it's a myth that, of course, Sartre turns into sort of foundation of the French and parts of the European left. It's a myth that exists today across the left. And, you know, I take this piece, I analyze this piece in my article, where you have a professor of Algerian history, you know, somebody who knows all the facts, saying, well, yes, all the emancipatory parts of the revolution were crushed, and anyone who was on the left in Algeria had to flee, but that shouldn't stop us from using Algeria as an inspirational model for our politics today. And I want to say, like, stop right there. That's exactly what it should do. And, you know, we can understand the successful aspects of Algerian counterinsurgency, take lessons from that if we're insurgents or something. But to say that we can't draw the lesson, or we shouldn't look at the actual politics of what happened to emancipation in Algeria, to people becoming freer, that's very frustrating to me, and that's the sort of willful blindness, only looking at our side. And if the Algerian rebels in 1960 were our side, well, then we know who our side is. And that's a sort of thinking that is inimical to winning in politics. And that interests me.
Mm-hmm. Before we get to Fanon, you use another, a part of the book that you're reviewing criticizes this sort of another schema, as it were, that the left uses to understand kinds of conflicts that are going on in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, which is this kind of settler colonizer versus colonized schema. And you talk about another quite influential person on the left, Andreas Malm, an influential Swedish academic who's author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, who then got turned into a film, I believe. So one of the things you criticize Malm for is using this schema of the lens of the broad lens of colonialism, say, to understand a broad spectrum of issues, from climate change to the war in Gaza. What is your problem with using that framework, in your view? I mean, you might say this is, as you say in your piece, it's one kind of hammer for everything, and then everything looks like the same problem. But aren't these problems arguably sort of, can be interpreted in a useful way through this lens? Both climate change and what's going on in Gaza.
To put it glibly, my problem with the way settler colonialism is being used today is the problem of the distinction between facts and values. And of course, philosophically, broad parts of the left dispute that there is a distinction between facts and values. But so let's not get down that rabbit hole. But I think there's a response to Kirsch's arguments, or arguments that say, if everything is settler, basically, in a nutshell, Kirsch's argument is, if everything is settlers versus colonists, and for the colonized to be given freedom has to be taken away from the settlers. If that's what politics looks like, then the settlers have no reason to negotiate. You've created a zero-sum vision of politics where, and by the way, we could talk about it, in climate change, many people understand the language of climate change politics to mean I'm going to have to get poorer for the climate to get better. And most people don't want to do that. So, there's a big degrowth left that says, well, we have to do that. And I'm not an economist. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that you're never going to get a majority in most democratic polities with that attitude. So it's the attitude of zero-sum politics. We just have to push the colonizers out for the settled to have freedom. Right. That's Kirsch's argument. I think there's a lot to chew over, maybe even admire in that argument. What interests me is the response to it from the left. So, for instance, a review that I cite in the Boston Review, but another review of the book that came out in Jewish Currents after my piece was already written. And these reviews basically say, well, Kirsch doesn't understand settler colonialism. Like, he doesn't get that it's real, that it's true, that it gives us an accurate picture of societies in maybe the US or Australia or Israel-Palestine. And my point is that you've missed the point, because of course it's a valuable social scientific or analytic paradigm. It's a form of path dependence analysis. You show that the effects of being colonized persist for hundreds of years. That's great. That's good science. Or in the case of Israel-Palestine, you show that Zionists themselves understood themselves as colonizers, and in the review in Jewish Currents, she acts like, well, if you read the good scholarship by any respectable a scholar of the political economy of Israel-Palestine, you understand, viewed themselves as colonizers, the Anglo-Palestine colonizing bank. Fine, great.
So the facts are there. It's an accurate description, but it's not a guide to what should be done.
That does not tell you anything about what should be done.
Right.
And the left seems to be so self-satisfied with its own academic achievements that it doesn't stop to ask, well, what sort of politics is going to get me 51%? And that, I think, Kirsch is paying attention to in a way that his left reviewers are ignoring.
So is it just pragmatics? Is it just that, well, you wouldn't be able to convince people of this, even if it is accurate, you wouldn't be able to get half the population to agree that this is an accurate description of what's going on? Or is it also that, the kinds of changes that will have to be put in place to get to a point where that is no longer so? I mean, what would it mean for America not to be a colonial state anymore? I don't know. You would need to dissolve the whole state. What would that really look like? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at too. I mean, what's the political ask? One, is it one that's going to be successful electorally? But yeah. Two, is it practical? Is it pragmatic? And is it going to be good for most people? And I think that's another sort of dangerous thing. On the left, we need to be, I tend to think that there's a balance between righting historic wrongs, which of course is important, and still understanding that a left politics is about equality for all, and not sort of ignoring the effects of a set of policies on the entire population of a given area.
So we said that there is a thinker, a philosopher whose spectre kind of haunts this whole discussion, and that is Frantz Fanon. Can you tell us a little bit about the uses and abuses, as it were, of his thinking on violence by the left?
Yeah, Frantz Fanon is a fascinating figure. I teach him. I love to teach him. He, for those who don't know, he was born in the French Caribbean, so he's a French citizen, but in a sort of colonized context in what are called the old colonies. And he, a very interesting life, fights in the Second World War, and their experiences, he's the liberator of France, but the French women won't dance with him. And for the first time, he realizes that the sort of liberté, égalité, fraternité he was sold didn't include him. Becomes a psychiatrist, and finally a revolutionary, joins the FLN, Front Libération Nationale in Algeria, and spends the rest of his life as a spokesperson for Algerian liberation. And the sort of key text in the left reception, or the key texts in the left reception of Fanon, are the first chapter of his book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is called Concerning Violence, where he talks about the disintoxifying power of violence for the colonized. And a previous book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon had explored the way in which it's hard for a colonized person to be a full subject, to achieve subjectivity in the way that Western philosophy, from Descartes through Sartre, had sort of viewed as the essential achievement of humanity. And Fanon sort of leaves that as an open question in Black Skin, White Masks. And in Wretched of the Earth, he seems to provide a solution or solve it and say, well, the way to regain subjectivity is through achieving one's freedom via violence, and or disintoxifying, removing the blemishes that colonization and the white gaze had sort of foisted upon the colonized person. And if Sartre, who's an admirer of Fanon's, writes an introduction to the book, and then sort of magnifies what Fanon said in a sort of extreme way. And it's not, and Kirsch finds this attitude, this philosophical attitude that freedom gets restored only through violence, must be restored through violence, behind a lot of the sort of left language around what Hamas was doing in Gaza, from Gaza on October 7th. Whether he's right or wrong, there's something to be said here, that Fanon's especially Mom, who you mentioned, and I don't like to take seriously, but he is unfortunately very widely read, and he's a great example of someone who says, well, of course, violence is good in any in the right in almost any context, in climate change, in Israel-Palestine. Just read Fanon. He doesn't even bother to sort of
explain why.
Run through Fanon. He doesn't. I don't need to say anything. You all know that Fanon is out there and made this argument for me. So Fanon's very particular life and thought really has become a totem for a sort of whole set of justifications, and that itself is very interesting. One of the things, obviously, that I'm trying to do in the piece is do a little bit of demystification, in that I'm a great admirer of Fanon as a thinker, but I don't think his life or thought give the lessons that a sort of casual reference to them might suggest.
And why? I mean, why is that, in terms of like, why is, again, looking at the kind of particularities here rather than just taking a general universal lesson from Fanon that, you know, when we come to an emancipatory struggle, violence is allowed. So that's the kind of like taking that rule away from, why isn't that the lesson of Frantz Fanon's kind of thinking on this?
I think one is the sort of ambiguity of his thought. And in Black Skin, White Masks, you know, he ends with, let me be someone who always asks. He himself, as an intellectual, was against these pieties. And the second side of that is when he descended into politics, he betrayed the commitment to questions. And so in Adam Schatz's magisterial biography, another book I recommend to everyone on the left, the Rebels Clinic, Schatz shows these many moments where Fanon either lied, or not only lied, covered up the most anti-liberatory aspects of the Algerian Revolution. So Fanon's own story is a story of how the struggle for emancipation ultimately can lead to anti-emancipatory outcomes, the sort of black night of totalitarianism and civil war ultimately. So I think both in his thought and his life, Fanon almost offers the exact opposite lesson that someone like Andreas Malm wants to draw from him. Yeah. Or that, you know, people who just sort of cite him offhand are ignoring.
You say in the piece that you're pretty comfortable critiquing the left on this issue because you yourself, biographically, when you were younger, saw this kind of, or felt this kind of allure for political violence. Since that, you've gone a very different direction and you've become a non-violent activist in Israel and Palestine, and you've been doing that for nearly a decade. How did that shift take place within you, and what have you learned from your kind of journey away from thinking of violence as a possible means to an end to seeing non-violence as a means to an end?
Well, I think insofar as violence was abstract for me, I could be attracted to it. And the shift for me was a moment, I think I talked about this in the interview with Anastasia, but a moment where, for the first time, you know, someone chucked a bottle at my head at a demonstration. And I realized I couldn't, you know, as much as I might romanticize, as many leftists do, those moments in Berlin where, you know, it's the Spartacists versus the Freikorps, or 1848 and we're on the barricades, or 1968, another problematic mythical moment. I couldn't defeat this person one-on-one, not because he was a better bottle thrower than me, although he probably was, but because the whole society was enabling him to throw that bottle. In a sense, I had already lost the democratic struggle in the way that this right-wing bottle thrower was never going to be arrested, because the society implicitly was on his side. And that you know, is the way that I have thought about violence in politics ever since. That violence is only part of a much bigger political chessboard, and a left that's committed to democracy, rule of law, and equality is going to be much more interested in the other parts of the chessboard. than the small moments of violence, because violence almost never succeeds. And the moments that it does are, I think, exceptional and can't be predicted. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin actually is probably the most successful political assassination of the 20th century. It got exactly what it wanted. But that,
say more about that for those who don't know the context.
So a right wing settler killed the Israeli prime minister, who was sort of on the crux of signing further deals with Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, and the Palestinian national movement. And that assassination ended the peace process effectively. For all sorts of various reasons. So that's a contingent moment where violence really worked. But you're almost never going to get that. And it only worked probably because there were other deeper forces at work in Israeli society that enabled it. But so, I mean, nonviolence was violence was not an option. Not resisting the occupation was not an option. So that left me with nonviolence. And I talked about this more at length with Anastasia. It's difficult because my nonviolent practice has failed to do any of the things that I want. And it's easy to be hopeless. And I think, I was just listening to a podcast of leftists sort of explaining, excusing left violence, I would say, as an outcome of hopelessness in the case of Luigi or
Right.
whatever it may be. And hopelessness is not a politics. And hopelessness is not an excuse for a violent politics that has no political rationale. So the question, what do you do in a moment of hopelessness? What do you look for? I mean, that's a question that I'm dealing with myself, but that's sort of been the evolution of my own praxis and commitment.
So that's one of the reasons you find the sort of appeal to political violence so troubling, is that you argue that it sort of cuts off the political imagination from thinking of alternatives, right, that could be viable. Political violence almost never achieves what it aims to achieve. Sometimes it achieves the exact opposite, as we might be witnessing now in the United States, for example, as a kind of backlash from Charlie Kirk's assassination is not yet unfolding, perhaps, but we've been promised that it's coming. So let's see what that is going to look like. But is it a problem, basically, that political violence, not to put it too finely, but kills, as it were, the political imagination and stops us from thinking of alternatives? And
yes, no, that's exactly right. And I didn't want to say, political violence is wrong because it's going to lead. It's like, killing the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and you've just caused World War I. Although I think in the case of Charlie Kirk, I think that's probably right. The outcome of this is going to be inconceivable. The problem is, as you've said, the excuse it gives you not to think about real politics, not to think about what would be necessary to achieve your aims through political persuasion. And we're fortunate enough to still live, many of us, in places that have functioning electoral systems. And there's no excuse. When you're a Spartacist before the Weimar democracy, and you don't know if there's even going to be elections in a year, that's one reason to go to the streets. But when you know there are going to be elections, you have no excuse for not trying to win. And I do think that political violence functions, and not even political violence, when we're talking about these magazines, talking about political violence,
right,
and romanticizing political violence, being wishy-washy or defensive about political violence, functions in the space, or takes up the space, that working on our real political commitments and strategies should be taking up.
I want to get to questions, but just to finish on this one, you've just said in your answer to this that basically, for most of the people that we're talking about, who are writing in ideas magazines and hosting podcasts and discussing these things online, political violence probably should not be one of the tools that they're thinking about when it comes to bringing about political change. But you don't want to rule out political violence, completely as a potential tool in bringing about political change. And you talk about Nelson Mandela as perhaps the best model. So without falling into the same trap of like thinking of one historical example as kind of like that's the way to do it, and then why is that the closest you think to a sort of legitimate use of political violence, and what can we learn from that?
Well, yeah, I appealed to Mandela for a couple of reasons. I mean, people always love to correct Mandela, the saint, the nonviolent saint, because Mandela did use violence. The ANC did use violence. But the wonderful thing about Mandela's famous uh, um, speech is that he explains that violence is to be used solely strategically, solely at moments where it has a clear and decisive purpose in the emancipatory struggle. And I think we can say our historical memory of what happened in South Africa is not of a brutal and senseless campaign. It's of a largely nonviolent campaign that used violence at moments, but whose most effective tool was the boycott and international pressure. And ultimately, when South Africa, when the revolution was won, South Africa turned into a democracy. Like, that's the win. That's the left goal. And you do have to judge political actions, in a sense, by their end, to think a little teleologically. And
Right.
so that's why Mandela is so appealing to me and interesting to me. Yes, we should correct Mandela, the sort of Gandhi, but we should also look at his violence the way he asked for it to be looked at, which is very strategically in the service of an entirely emancipatory struggle.
But as you said, do you think we look at it, as it were, as an example because of how things turned out? And if things had turned out differently, we might be thinking again about this is a kind of another Algeria case where we romanticize it, but actually it wasn't all that all that great in the end.
That's
So
fine.
it's a sort of contingent exactly. Reasons for why they worked.
I'm recommending a politics of contingency for the left, and I take contingency to be, I thought the sort of left philosophy was heading in that direction, but and so that's the direction I think we should be heading. Yes, judge every case contingently and on its own indistinguishable conditions and merits.
I'd like to ask the audience to type in their questions in the Q&A. I'll start with George Gonzalez has a few questions. I think I'm going to ask one of them and then move on to the others. Let's talk about the Fanon question. So George writes, Fanon is writing in a context where imperialism is aiming to violently crush the anti-colonial movement. Is it a mistake to broadly theorize about a distinct moment in history?
Yeah, I mean, I would say exactly it is. Everything from the sort of post-colonial moment in Africa that Fanon was involved in, and Fanon is very interested in linking Algeria to other African countries and struggles that are happening sort of at the same time. To compare that to, I mean, I guess we have to say Hamas, it just misses the entire point of history. It's the difference between a political Islamist movement with its own intellectual genealogy reaching back to Hassan al-Banna and the struggle between communist liberation, liberal nationalist movements, an entirely different world of the 1960s. And that's exactly the sort of distinction that I think is helpful and necessary.
Yeah, and as you say in your essay, kind of judging even the even if one thought Hamas's use of violence kind of legitimate in some way, judging by the result of where we've arrived at this point, clearly that was a failure, right? That was not the right kinds of strategy, and could never possibly be for because of the sort of disuniformity of power between the state of Israel and Hamas.
Although, I mean, let me make a little hay out of that for 1 second, where I believe it was Jewish Currents published an article that basically the position that they took was, well, yes, 70,000 Palestinians are dead, but you're talking about it. This was actually a success for Hamas. And that is, again, I mean, I don't see how you can't see in that the same sort of totalitarian thinking that Kirsch links back to earlier left errors.
Yeah.
70,000 people dead is a failure, and full stop. And to go beyond that and say, oh, well, but, is already one thought too many.
Yeah. Someone questions your celebrating Mandela, asking whether it's a contradiction to your previous kind of criticism of anti-colonial movements. So what do you say to that?
Well, I don't criticize anti-colonial movements, full stop. I mean, I'm against colonialism and imperialism, broadly conceived. So the question is how we can have the right sort of emancipatory struggle. And I think obviously what happens in South Africa is imperfect. I mean, if you look at South Africa today, deeply, deeply an egalitarian society, riven by crime, all sorts of corruption problems, but it has the sort of bare minimum necessary for a free society, which is a functioning electoral democracy. That's a success. And for all sorts of reasons that I try to sort of begin with, I do measure success democratically. And so that's why I believe in the South African model, if we have to pick a model. But of course, again, I'm against universals.
Fred L., I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Is it ethical to dissimulate expression in order to gain broader acceptance for an achievable limited goal? Yeah, not sure I get that, Fred. If you want to rephrase your question, and we can discuss it. Someone in the other chat says Fanon also wrote on Palestine. What did Fanon think about the Palestinian kind of question?
Well, Fanon was actually fairly admiring of what the Zionists had managed to do. So, and he wrote before, 1967 and the ongoing occupation. So I think, Fanon didn't have the all the facts. I don't find his writings on Palestine so useful. Because the Palestine that he was writing about is simply so different from the Palestine that we know today.
Yeah. There are no more questions. Let me bring something that kind of brings us to today's news. So the UK has today announced recognition of the Palestinian state. I believe France was about to do the same. I don't know if it's already done so. So adding its name to the list of a lot of other countries. Again, there are some, like Israel, for example, who say by doing this, you're essentially giving Hamas a sort of prize. And some people might say, well, look, it worked. Maybe it's not the fact that we're talking about it, but here there's a real political movement on the side of the West now, kind of moving in a position where before it was too reluctant to. So what do you say to that sort of analysis that, well, maybe politically this will bring about something that will be eventually beneficial to the Palestinian people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical. I think the recognition is on the whole a good thing. There was a Palestinian official who called it our Balfour Declaration. So, grounding Palestinian national aspirations in international recognition as they're already grounded in sort of the UN and international law is good. These declarations leave a lot of room for various actual political outcomes.
Yeah.
And to say that this is direct outcome of Hamas's actions, I think is not right. It's a direct outcome of Netanyahu's actions, Israel's actions. And yeah. I mean, I do think that that Hamas sort of predicted to some extent what Israel would do, but not. I think that gives Hamas slightly too much credit. to say that this was like a grand strategy, especially when you understand how Hamas sold this operation to themselves, how they talked about it among themselves. And I don't think the sort of Palestinian state that the UK and France are planning to recognize is the sort of Palestinian state that Hamas wants. So I don't think this is a win for Hamas. On the whole, it's a good thing, but again, insofar as it's a nonviolent path, only time will tell.
A tangential question in the comments asking about the first book that you strongly recommended. I think it's Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Was that it?
Yeah.
And then there was a Frantz Fanon biography that you also highly recommended. Remind us what that was?
That was The Rebels Clinic by Adam Schatz. And I think actually both books offer similar lessons in a sense, in that they wade into the actual politics of emancipatory struggles. And Orwell's book is this fantastic account of the differences, the factional strife, and the way in which what crushed the best parts of the Spanish Revolution weren't actually the fascists, they were the Stalinists. And I mean, he's writing from personal experience, and one could maybe draw. I'm sure people have quarreled with his conclusions, but there are few better accounts of how emancipatory struggles can be undermined by non-emancipatory methods. And Schatz, I think, shows similar things about Fanon's participation in the day-to-day politics, interfactional politics of the FLN. Which can be lionized, but included good parts and bad parts, and the bad parts ultimately won. And it's interesting and important to understand why. Why did the bad parts win out? How could we do otherwise?
Mm-hmm. So an anonymous person asks, isn't the Gaza genocide supporting the position that Israel is a colonial project? I think you agree with that. That's not really what we're contesting in some ways, is it? It's about whether just recognition of that fact then gives us a guide to action. And then the follow-up question is about, is it that discrediting of the Israel as a democratic project is if what is going on in Gaza is a genocide, is it discrediting Israel as a democratic project?
Well, yeah, I mean,
you have critical words for
Israel's not a democracy right now, insofar as no country that rules over millions of people who don't have the right to vote can be called a democracy. It's not. It's something much closer to apartheid. That's probably what I would call it. And so it's not. You didn't need the crimes against humanity to get the fact that Israel isn't a democracy. The question, how do you turn Israel into a democracy, is the more interesting one. And a revolutionary war fought against civilians is not the answer. That doesn't move us across the chessboard towards Israel as a democracy, or towards two democracies between the river and the sea, whatever solution you want. So yeah, I just want to decouple the rightful criticism that Israel is not a democracy from the sort of conclusion that therefore anything we do against it is justified, or anything we do against it is a good idea.
Right. Joshua Pace asks something that I think you touch upon in your piece. Yes, how does the left, broadly speaking, determine which situations merit ideological support and which do not? Most political situations are grey, say Israel, Palestine, Russia, and Ukraine. How then are they to be? How do they get turned into black-white issues so dramatically? And I think this is one of the schemas that you criticize, this sort of like reduction of a lot of conflicts between good and evil and these kind of like Manichaean terms. So how do we retain nuance whilst also somehow choosing sides, or seeing kind of the fault lying more on one side than the other?
Yeah, I do. I think that's an excellent question. And in the piece, I talk about colonizer colonized or settler colonized as basically a heuristic that the left uses today. It's very useful to have heuristics to help us see the world. I can look at a situation and say, oh, through skin color or through the history of colonization, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and what that means. And for all the reasons that we've sort of talked about, that way madness lies. I think more generally, and of course the left is not immune to is not the only party that does this, the right even more so, is the friend-enemy distinction of our side and the other side. And here I do want to say just a little something about Charlie Kirk and the sort of discourse in the wake of that, because I think there's the position taken by, I think, liberals or left liberals saying, well, we have to recognize that Charlie Kirk was doing the sort of thing that we want to do. The famous Ezra Klein,
yes.
He was doing politics the right way.
Yeah.
And then the left response saying, are you crazy? Think about who he was, what he stood for, and there's no need to sort of cozy up, brush that under the rug. We need a little bit more clarity about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And well, okay, I want to sort of reach a position somewhere in the middle and say, insofar as someone like Charlie Kirk was debating and doing political organizing, Ezra Klein is right. That is the sort of democratic politics that the left needs to take to heart and do well. But what Ezra Klein ignores is that Charlie Kirk was playing a game that ultimately was meant to undermine democracy, where actually we're going to get professors fired for what they say. Actually, we don't value freedom of speech. Maybe I value it discursively when I'm debating you across a table, but in the society that I want to build, there won't be freedom of speech. So, and I think, and so we need to be able to. That's a gray position. That Charlie Kirk is not all evil, in that there's something to admire in what he did, but that shouldn't confuse us as to the aims of left politics, which are a democratic society, which Charlie Kirk was completely opposed to. So we have to muddy the waters, and that's frustrating because you listen to a leftist podcast and they say, "Come on, Ezra Klein, Charlie Kirk was bad," and you listen to Ezra Klein and he says like, "Oh, this is the sort of guy I am." And neither of those positions is right. But that takes us two steps further than often we get to go.
Yeah, he did. Ezra Klein mentioned that this is the column that he's had the most backlash about in his entire career, which is quite interesting. I had something to say on this, but it's escaped me now. Maybe we'll take one last question from George Gonzalez about different contexts within which we talk about political violence. We talked earlier about we live in, sort of, generally democratic societies, peace-loving, whatever, in which freedom of speech is something that we can still take for granted, maybe not take for granted, but something we can still enjoy. How do we think of political violence in that context versus the context of an anti-colonial movement in a context that is non-democratic, that doesn't have freedom of speech, doesn't have equal rights, all the rest of it? Are we condemning political violence in both contexts equally, or do we have to think about them differently by looking at the specifics?
Yeah, I think we absolutely have to look at every case on its own merits. And if you look, if Hamas had really wanted this to be a struggle against the occupation in the strict sense, its targets would have only been the military, and Mahmoud Khalil said this in his interview with Ezra Klein, and I agree with him. The principle of non-combatant immunity or citizen immunity, that's a sacred principle of international law, but also of the left. And so, we do have general principles which can guide us in figuring out when violence is justified and when not. And of course, are there other alternatives? Is there a democratic process those are going to be all important pieces of the mix of determining the justification for violence, but every case on its own merits.
Jacob Abolafia, thank you very much for this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for being here and for your lively chat and questions. The Philosopher in the News will be back next month with an episode on something I haven't decided on yet. We'll see where the news agenda takes us. Hopefully not somewhere even darker than where we are today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for your piece, which was extremely thought-provoking and I'd say quite brave within the context of everything and the way that discussions around this topic has been. I thought you handled it with extreme care and with intellectual clarity, and it was a very helpful piece for me to read. And then also the follow-up interview that you did with Anastasia Berg, again on the Points Substack, and I recommend along the readings that you suggested that people go and read the original essay and your follow-up interview with that.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you everyone. Hope to see you soon.